What if some of the greatest movies of the 1970s were not loved at all when they first arrived? What if critics walked out, audiences stayed away, and studios quietly buried them? These films were not failures of imagination. They were failures of timing, taste, and courage. Tonight, we begin a journey through 12 box office bombs from the 1970s that lost everything on release, but gained immortality later. Number 12. THX 1138, 1971. Before there was a galaxy far, far away, George Lucas crafted a vision of the future that was terrifying, sterile, and profoundly misunderstood. When THX 1138 arrived in theaters in 1971, audiences were not ready for its cold, clinical embrace. Viewers who expected the escapism of traditional science fiction walked in and were immediately stunned by its slow rhythms, heavy atmosphere, and moral ambiguity. The film refused to offer the comfort of names or faces, featuring a cast of bald, uniformed citizens identified only by numbers and letters. Critics dismissed Lucas's debut as cold, distant, and emotionally hollow. Warner Brothers panicked, seeing the audience resistance, and the film vanished from theaters almost immediately. What audiences did not understand at the time was that THX 1138 was operating on an entirely different wavelength. Lucas crafted a future soaked not in neon, but in a blinding, oppressive whiteness, a world of total surveillance and mandatory sedation where humanity itself felt exhausted. Robert Duvall played a hero who barely fit the mold of a hero at all, a man whose only act of rebellion was to stop taking his drugs and start feeling. The world felt oppressive and morally compromised. It was not escapism, it was a prophecy of a world consumed by state-mandated consumerism and the death of the individual. Studio interference flattened the mystery as executives tried to force a more traditional narrative onto a film that was meant to be a sensory experience. Only years later, through home video and the rising fame of its director, did the real THX 1138 emerge. Viewers finally experienced the story as a meditation on identity and the fragility of the human spirit within a machine. Modern science fiction, from the dystopian grit of the 80s to the minimalist thrillers of today, was essentially born from its failure. It became a sacred text for fans because it demanded reflection rather than easy entertainment. What once felt alien became familiar, and what once failed financially became priceless culturally. Number 11. Sorcerer, 1977. In 1977, William Friedkin was the most powerful director in Hollywood, fresh off the massive successes of The French Connection and The Exorcist. But his magnum opus, Sorcerer, was released into a hostile environment. It arrived in theaters the same month as Star Wars, a moment when audiences were embracing hopeful futures and lighthearted adventure. Sorcerer offered none of that. It was bleak, paranoid, and merciless. The film tells a story of four outcasts transporting highly unstable nitroglycerin through a treacherous jungle. Critics recoiled at its cynicism, and viewers stayed away in droves. The box office numbers were disastrous, and the film was labeled an excessive, self-indulgent failure. Yet, what terrified and repelled people then is exactly what fascinates them now. The film stripped the thriller genre down to raw, existential distrust. There were no traditional heroes, only desperate survivors pushed to the brink of insanity. Friedkin shot the film like a siege, where death crept silently and exploded without warning. The practical effects, including the legendary scene of a truck crossing a fraying suspension bridge in a rainstorm, were condemned at the time as grotesque and unnecessary. Today, they are revered as some of the most groundbreaking and dangerous work ever put on screen. Every scene feels physical, painful, and real. Nothing is digital, and nothing feels safe. The film's ending, a masterpiece of cosmic irony and defeat, sealed its cult status. It was an ending audiences were not ready for in the summer of 1977, but later generations embraced it completely for its uncompromising vision. Sorcerer became a masterclass in slow-burn tension and existential dread. It failed because it refused to offer comfort or a happy ending. It endured because it told a difficult truth. that survival is lonely, fate is indifferent, and sometimes the world breaks you despite your best efforts. Number 10. Barry Lyndon, 1975. Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon died at the box office because, in 1975, no one knew how to sell a 3-hour epic that moved with the stillness of a museum gallery. Studios tried to market it as a grand historical romance, but audiences expecting a traditional hero story were left baffled. What they got instead was a subversive subversion of the great man biography that quietly mocked the idea of social climbing and noble ambition. Ryan O'Neal's Redmond Barry is confident, ambitious, and completely wrong about the world he is trying to conquer. He believes he is the hero of his own story, but Kubrick's camera makes him a sidekick to history and fate. That irony sailed over audiences' heads in 1975. Critics called the film messy, juvenile in its cynicism, and focused far too much on its technical achievements. The studio pulled it quickly when the ticket sales plummeted. However, time revealed the genius. Barry Lyndon was a love letter to the 18th century, filtered through Kubrick's irreverent and cold humor. It celebrated the absurdity and chaos of human life. It refused to take its characters' drama seriously, daring viewers to look at the big picture of time and mortality. Home video and film schools transformed its legacy. Fans and cinematographers quoted its lighting techniques endlessly. What once felt strange and too slow became endlessly rewatchable for its sheer beauty and depth. Its characters were colorful in their flaws, its visuals were inventive, using NASA-engineered lenses to shoot by candlelight, and its tone was fearless. The film did not fail because it was bad. It failed because it was smarter and more patient than its marketing. Today, it stands as one of the boldest experiments of the decade, a cult masterpiece that trusts the audience to catch up eventually. Number 9. The Warriors, 1979. When The Warriors fought its way into theaters in 1979, it existed in a world that did not exist anywhere else. Director Walter Hill called it a rock and roll fable, but audiences in the late 70s struggled to grasp what that truly meant. The film was not strictly set in the past or a grounded present. It lived in a mythic, neon-soaked New York where leather jackets ruled the night streets and music functioned like destiny. Viewers were confused by its heightened reality, and critics were baffled by its comic book logic. Ticket sales vanished quickly after reports of real-world violence in theaters led to a panicked marketing withdrawal. What The Warriors offered was pure, stylized emotion. The story was simple. A gang is framed for a murder they didn't commit, and they must travel from the north of the city back to their home turf in Coney Island. But the presentation turned this simple journey into an operatic force. Fire, light, and the rhythmic pulse of the city shaped every scene. Characters felt larger than life and deliberately artificial, behaving like modern knights in a concrete labyrinth. The film did not chase realism, it chased a specific feeling of urban myth. Audiences in 1979 were not ready for this approach. They wanted clear genres and safe, predictable expectations. The Warriors rejected both, and it was quickly dismissed as a dangerous curiosity. Home video resurrected it. A new generation of viewers embraced its style, and its atmosphere outlived its thin plot. The film became a visual influence rather than just a narrative one, with its fashion and slang being absorbed into the cultural lexicon. It became a cult masterpiece because it understood that mood and myth can matter more than logic. It failed because it arrived too early, but it succeeded because its unique style never truly ages. Number 8. Suspiria, 1977. Dario Argento's Suspiria was too disturbing and too abstract to survive a mainstream release in 1977. It was a sensory manifesto disguised as a horror film, a nightmare of primary colors and screeching music. Audiences recoiled from its surreal violence, and the box office suffered badly. The film was labeled by many as obscene, confusing, and dangerously loud. The story follows an American ballet student who arrives at a prestigious German academy only to discover it is a front for a sinister coven of witches. But Suspiria did not explain itself because explanation was not the point. It was about how sound and color could reshape the human mind and body. In an era before the internet and the explosion of global art house horror, this felt like insanity. Audiences were not ready to confront a film that prioritized nightmare logic over a cohesive script. Time changed everything. Suspiria became prophetic for the elevated horror movement. Scholars revisited its use of Technicolor, and fans dissected its every frame. The imagery, once mocked for being too vivid, felt more like an accurate representation of a subconscious fear. The practical effects remained shocking, and the ideas behind its architecture of terror remained deeply unsettling. It does not age because its visual warning grows louder and more impressive every year. It failed financially because it frightened people away with its sensory overload. It became a cult masterpiece because that very fear, that the world is not what it seems and that beauty can be lethal, turned out to be a universal human truth. Number 7. Eraserhead, 1977. Eraserhead was dead on arrival because it fought the very idea of traditional cinema. David Lynch delivered a dystopian nightmare filled with industrial decay, absurdity, and profound despair. Studios had no idea how to sell a film that was black and white, nearly silent, and featured a crying mutant infant. The result was a limited release that buried the film financially almost immediately. The world of Eraserhead is suffocating. Machinery replaces humanity, and dreams become the only, albeit terrifying, escape. It was not comfortable entertainment. It was a confrontation with the anxieties of fatherhood and urban isolation. Critics were divided. Some praised its raw ambition, while others called it indulgent and repulsive. Audiences stayed away. The film felt too strange and too dark for its time, but Lynch never stopped believing in its singular vision. Slowly, through midnight screenings, the true power of the film emerged. When viewers finally saw Eraserhead as it was intended, as a visual poem rather than a narrative movie, it clicked. The film spoke to every outsider who felt crushed by a reality they couldn't understand. Its imagery haunted the viewer long after the credits rolled. Its industrial soundscape cut deep into the psyche. Its ending refused to offer a traditional compromise. Eraserhead became a cult masterpiece because it told a psychological truth without softening the blow. It did not want approval, it wanted honesty. Time eventually rewarded that courage, making it the definitive example of independent cult cinema. Number 6. The Wicker Man, 1973. The Wicker Man was tossed into theaters as a second feature throwaway, existing in a world that did not yet know how to classify folk horror. The studio believed so little in its success that the original film negatives were literally buried under a motorway. When the film arrived in theaters in 1973, audiences were profoundly confused. They expected the familiar monsters of Hammer horror, but instead they were confronted with a slow, intellectual, and deeply disturbing exploration of the clash between ancient paganism and modern Christianity. Critics met it with bewilderment, and the box office returns were negligible. Marketing campaigns tried to sell it as a standard thriller, but the film's power lay in its atmosphere, bright, sun-drenched, and yet unbearably sinister. Edward Woodward played a devout policeman whose very righteousness becomes a trap. This world was not filled with shadows, it was bathed in light and songs that masked an inevitable cruelty. The film rejected cheap jump scares, focusing instead on the slow build of existential dread. Its finale, a giant burning figure against the sunset, became one of the most powerful images in cinema history. But in 1973, it only caused discomfort and rejection. Only decades later, through dedicated fans and restored prints, did The Wicker Man take its place as a masterpiece. It proved that the most terrifying monster is not a creature from the shadows, but the unshakable faith of a crowd. The film failed because it demanded more than just fear from the viewer. It demanded a reflection on the nature of God and sacrifice. Today, it stands as a titan that defined the aesthetics of an entire genre. Number 5. Assault on Precinct 13, 1976. John Carpenter's assault on Precinct 13 collapsed at the American box office because it was too minimalist and too brutal for its time. In 1976, audiences were not ready for an action movie that behaved like a horror film. Studios didn't know how to market a picture that lacked clear heroes in shining armor, where the enemy was a faceless, almost supernatural mob advancing from the darkness. Viewers were shocked by the infamous ice cream truck scene, and critics labeled the film primitive and excessively bloody. Carpenter created a modern Western trapped within the concrete walls of a police station, stripped of pathos and unnecessary words. His music, a pulsing, gritty synthesizer rhythm, drove contemporaries mad, as they viewed it as a cheap substitute for an orchestra. However, it was precisely this music and this minimalism that later became the foundation for the entire action horror genre. The film made no attempt to explain the motives of the attackers. It transformed them into a force of nature, into pure chaos, against which former enemies, a cop and a convict, must unite. It was a cinema of survival, where dialogue was sparse and actions were fatal. Only after a triumph at European festivals and success on home video did Assault on Precinct 13 achieve cult status. It taught future directors that tension is more important than budget, and that silence can be louder than an explosion. The film failed financially because it rejected Hollywood gloss in favor of the harsh, cold truth of survival. Today, it is considered a benchmark of pure cinema. Number 4. Pink Flamingos, 1972. Pink Flamingos was too dangerous to survive in a mainstream release. John Waters delivered a manifesto of trash culture that was intentionally engineered to provoke nausea, rage, and delight simultaneously. Audiences recoiled. Critics argued over whether it was art or a crime. The box office was disastrous, and the film was banned in several countries, labeled as obscene. Divine played a heroine fighting for the title of the filthiest person alive. This was not comfortable entertainment. It was a frontal assault on bourgeois values and the very notion of good taste. The film did not explain itself, because explanation would have destroyed its chaotic energy. In 1972, this felt like insanity. The screens pulsed with filth, bizarreness, and shock content that had no equal. Only through midnight screenings and underground theaters did the true power of Pink Flamingos emerge. The film became prophetic for the aesthetics of punk and camp. Lines that were once considered repulsive began to be quoted as manifestos of freedom. Its imagery ceased to be just dirty. It became a symbol of radical self-expression. Pink Flamingos does not age, because its challenge to society only becomes more relevant. The film failed because it terrified people with its uncompromising nature. It became a cult masterpiece because it proved that in a world full of fake purity, filth is the only way to be honest. Number 3. Zardoz, 1974. Zardoz is perhaps the most visually shocking failure of the 1970s. When it arrived in 1974, audiences were greeted by the sight of Sean Connery, the world's most famous James Bond, wearing a red loincloth and thigh-high boots in a world of floating stone heads and psychedelic philosophy. The film was met with literal laughter in theaters. Critics called it a self-indulgent mess, a drug-fueled disaster, and a career killer for director John Boorman. It vanished from cinemas almost instantly, leaving behind a reputation of being a high-budget joke. But to look at Zardoz only as a failure is to miss one of the most daring intellectual experiments in science fiction history. Boorman wasn't trying to make a blockbuster. He was trying to film a fever dream about the end of humanity. The film explores a future where the elite have achieved immortality but lost their souls, living in a vortex of eternal boredom, while the rest of humanity lives in a wasteland of brutal survival. It was a film about class, entropy, and the necessity of death to give life meaning. In 1974, this was far too abstract for a public that wanted another Star Wars or Planet of the Apes. But as the decades passed, Zardoz found its home among the avant-garde. Its bizarre imagery, once mocked, became iconic for its sheer fearlessness. It became a cult masterpiece because it is truly singular. There is nothing else like it in the history of film. It failed because it refused to compromise its madness for the sake of clarity. And it survived because that madness turned out to be a brilliant, haunting vision of our own fractured future. Number 2. Days of Heaven, 1978. Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven is often cited today as one of the most beautiful films ever made, but in 1978, it was a commercial ghost. The production was a disaster. Malick spent years in the editing room struggling to find a story in the hundreds of hours of footage he shot almost entirely during the golden hour of sunset. When it finally reached the screen, audiences found it too slow, too quiet, and too disconnected from traditional drama. It was a massive financial loss for Paramount, and Malick was so discouraged that he disappeared from filmmaking for the next 20 years. The film failed because it treated cinema as poetry rather than prose. It relied on a whispered voiceover from a child and a series of breathtaking silent images to tell a story of love, betrayal, and the plague of locusts in the Texas Panhandle. It didn't care about plot points or character development in the way the 70s audience expected. It cared about the light on the wheat fields and the way the wind felt against the skin. Time, however, has been incredibly kind to Days of Heaven. As the fast-paced, loud era of the blockbuster took over, this film became a sanctuary for those seeking something deeper. It became a cult masterpiece because it proved that film could be a visual prayer. Its technical achievements, shooting by natural light and capturing the raw soul of the American landscape, became the gold standard for every cinematographer who followed. It was rejected for its stillness, but it is that very stillness that makes it immortal today. Number 1. Apocalypse Now, 1979. In 1979, the world believed Francis Ford Coppola had lost his mind. The production of Apocalypse Now was not just a movie shoot, it was a descent into madness that lasted years, plagued by typhoons, a leading man's heart attack, and a budget that spiraled so out of control that Coppola had to mortgage his own home and assets to finish it. Before it even hit theaters, the industry had already labeled it Apocalypse Never. Critics were sharpened for a slaughter, calling it an ego-driven disaster and a confusing, bloated mess of a war movie. It was the ultimate box office gamble that felt destined to fail. The film failed to find a massive audience initially because it wasn't the heroic Vietnam story people expected. It was a hallucinatory, psychedelic journey into the dark heart of the human soul. It was loud, chaotic, and ended with a philosophical monologue from a shadowed Marlon Brando that left audiences baffled. People wanted a clear narrative of good versus evil. Coppola gave them a sensory overload about the thin line between civilization and savagery. It was a film that didn't just show war, it felt like a fever dream of war. But as the smoke cleared, the world realized that Coppola hadn't made a mistake. He had made a miracle. Apocalypse Now became the definitive cinematic statement on the 20th century's most controversial conflict. Its technical achievements, from the terrifying sound design to the legendary cinematography, redefined what was possible on a screen. It stands at number 1 because it is the ultimate example of a film that was too much for its time. It was too big, too dark, and too experimental. It broke its director and nearly broke its studio, but it emerged as a towering monument of art. It is a cult masterpiece because it doesn't just tell a story, it creates an experience that stays with you forever. It proved that a box office bomb could eventually become the very soul of cinema history. These films of the 1970s were not rejected because they were bad. They were rejected because they arrived too early, too strange, or too honest for the world they were born into. But time has a way of correcting the verdict. The audiences returned, the meaning emerged, and what once failed in the darkness of an empty theater became unforgettable forever.